reader who likes to be immersed in all forms of art and believes art to be salvation in an improbable, stochastic world. He has submitted research papers in various disciplines, including medical humanities, translation and transcreation, epic traditions, oral traditions in Jadavpur University, Benares in the University, among others, and have a few published write ups. He's interested in pedagogical learning and wants to research on memory studies and its implications with comparative literature and other arts later on in his academic career. I'm sure Shodhi will go on to do that. Let me now introduce Shonakshi for the evening. Shonakshi Ghosh is currently studying comparative literature from Jadavpur University. She's an avid enthusiast about the nature of human life and like to paint in her free time. She's also an enthusiast about popular fiction, autofiction, and humanism in general. So, on that note, I would invite our speakers to kindly come in. Their presentation is already visible. So, and for our audience today, welcome to another episode of Victorian Sundays. I'm sure these young students, scholars, will give a very enlightening lecture for today's evening. And Shubhodip and Shonakshi, the stage is all yours. If you can kindly comments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially Ritamda. We have had the privilege of studying under Ritamda. So, thanks really a lot. Good evening, everyone. Today, our topic is a very interesting one because it's not limited to a Victorian period, but rather what we're trying to do is that we have taken an aspect of Victorian period that was previously present, and what we have tried to do rather here is that we have taken the aspect far and beyond. The topic of our today's talk is basically from promiscuity to prominence, the journey of Victorian maritime mythical sea animals into popular culture. Now, this myths and culture are very intertwined and intertwinedly related to each other. Before we go into the topic, there needs to be a very brief understanding of the travelogue between myths and stories. Um, I hope the PPT is visible.
Yes, a PPT is visible. You can
Yeah,
go
okay.
ahead.
So, the Victorian sea voyage for the first time brought the nuance of colonialism, environmental degradation, technological advancement into our day to day world. At around the same similar time, Darwin's theory of evolution gave it a slight contrast, as in whether it was in contrast to each other, whether it was in accumulation to each other, with respect to each other. The rise of the cryptozoology or the cryptids that we know of. It collapsed the boundary of between science, history, geology, and folklore. It represents the relationship between the sea and the human beings, including the voyagers and the fishermen, sometimes depicting attachment, sometimes loss, sometimes desire, and oftentimes destruction and futility. Through this metaphor of sea creatures, sea animals. It's a testament of all this impossible, all these improbable descriptions of this cryptids are a testament to the oral folklore and global community even at that point of time before the because of the travelogue that they had to do all from one place to another place to see Victorian at the Victorian time. It also very interesting represents that we'll come to later on the representation of women through this idea of cryptids. The stories are often changed again as any myth and culture goes. It's always changed. It's always moving. It's a very dynamic sort of representation, and we'll try to follow through it to understand the travelogue between them. Also, one important thing to remember is that the Christianity has been the purveyor of this journey in its essence, and the tourism with the advent of blue Victorian colonization and class differentiation became a main facet of traveling. The barriers of class differentiation broke down, whereas the advancement of science, there was an incessant need to preserve the mysticism of life. So thereby, what we also see in our talk is that there is a very sudden increase in in its attempt to preserve this mysticism of life as the science of biology was advancing. Um, Many of these folklores were spread by the sailors or among coastal towns by people who associated things like mermaid with storms and curses. However, things like mermaid folktales were also popular all over the world. It was described in the same manner, but are called many different names by the sea folks. Names Morgan, Sizak, Binvari, Mero, Hormond, and many others. Um, One king in the France even incorporated maid dressed up as mermaids to great guests in one of his galas. this wide distribution of mermaid, for example, has been a very this in all the sea creatures that we'll see here, we see a lot of various depictions throughout it. So Nakshi will take on from here for now.
Yeah. So the first, uh, wait. So the first creature we're gonna take is the kraken. Its origin in the Victorian era saw the sea monster prominently featured in literature, most notably in Alfred Lord Tennyson's 1830 poem *The Kraken*. Tennyson's poem depicts the kraken as a colossal creature sleeping in the deep ocean, destined to awaken and die at the surface, and is often interpreted as a metaphor for the imagination of the unknown depths of the human side. The poem also reflects contemporary scientific discoveries and the changing views on the age of Earth. Now let's go on to its specifications. It's a legendary beast that has haunted old sailor stories, folklore, and literature since the 13th century. An enormous squid-like creature, the kraken is supposedly capable of dragging entire ships down to its dwelling place in the deepest reaches of the ocean. Now coming to its modern representation. H.P. Lovecraft is probably the old French most famous creation. Sorry, one second. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. You are.
Yeah. So, H.P. Lovecraft is probably the old gent's most famous creation, described by the Lovecraft himself as resembling an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature. This creature is largely inspired from the idea of the kraken and the sea monster. The sea monster names can be confusing, and the kraken is a prime example. The word comes to us from Norwegian, where it means unhealthy or twisted animal, but is entered in the popular lexicon when it was borrowed from one of the main antagonist monsters in Ray Harryhausen's The Clash of the Titans. While Harryhausen's kraken was a humanoid sea monster with tentacle-like arms and fishy tail, the mythological kraken more closely resembles a giant squid. The second Pirates of the Caribbean movie featured a more mythological, accurate depiction of the kraken, while the 2010 remake of The Clash of the Titans boasted a critter that was something of a mixture of the two and also incorporating some crab-like elements. Now, passing on to my friend Shubham.
So the next cryptid that I come to is mermaid. In Victorian literature, mermaid first appeared in Alfred Tennyson's poem *The Mermaid*, which was published in his collection of poems, chiefly lyrical, in 1830. The poem features a male persona who imagines himself as a mermaid frolicking in the sea. While mermaids had appeared in folklore and earlier literature like Homer's Odyssey, Tennyson's poem is a notably early example in their presence in Victorian poetry. Other Victorian works that feature mermaids include Hans Christian Andersen's *The Little Mermaid*. Interestingly enough, mermaid is a very wide, varied depiction of how it's are. It is the androgynous nature of mermaid. It has been for a long time been a household name, and it appealed to Victorian imagination a lot. Since again the travelogue and all, because of the Victorian maritime travels in the sea voyages, what you see is that the description of mermaid is present throughout the whole world. Um, for instance, the creation of for instance, that we can see is that in um, Norway or in other parts of the world, we see various depictions of sirens and mermaids and mermaids and sirens as figures of indeterminate gender in the art and poetry of the late Victorian era, and how these figures may still be used as symbols of transgender and non-binary communities in the Victorian period and today. Androgynous representation of sirens and mermaids, also representations of prostitutes and sexually transmitted diseases. Pre-Raphaelite's representation of the mythical animals, and therefore what you see also mermaid is also representation of the sisterhood and womanhood, as in the case of Evelyn de Morgan, whereas where the male representation of mermaid is sexualized and often used as threats. Sirens pulling men in Victorian era that was represented a lot by the Victorian era paintings also describes the tension between the venereal disease prostitutions. Here in the slide that we see is a painting by this person Evelyn de Morgan, where you see the mermaid has having a very masculine feature. So this mermaid, this is a very different, non-general description of of a mermaid who having a very masculine feature and luring the men into the ocean body. So all these things, what is also and the androgynous nature even at the Victorian era and even now, mermaids are often sometimes it's again as Tennyson put it out as as a male frolicking in the sun. Later on, it came out to be published to be as a woman calling out the men in and bewitching beauty. And sirens also somehow got related to mermaids later on, again for the same question of bewitching the sailors. So we also see very interestingly, as we discussed here, the mermaids represented by female authors or female painters has a very distinctive nature to it, and the male authors has a very pertinent male gaze attached with the representation of mermaid. The creation of modern forms of entertainment and the widespread of rejection of the existence of mermaids have led to 20th century representation of mermaids as beautiful and kind creatures. That is the modern interpretation as of now. um, very interestingly, one of the very prominent modern interpretations are the Disney's cinema, The Little Mermaid. But The Little Mermaid was originally written by as a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. It tells the story of a mermaid princess who yearns to be human after falling in love with a human prince. She makes a deal with the sea witch, sacrificing her voice for legs, but ultimately she doesn't win the prince's love, and her only path to an immortal soul lies in the selfless acts for in the purgatory. But in the Disney's movie, what you see is that a rather sexist version of it, a very lucid version of it. So throughout the time, as of now, the sensations behind the mermaid has been very lucidified. It's been very liquidified. The contexts are sort of not given to us. We also see this example of the mermaid of Zenor, a Cornish folktale. In the Cornish folktale, is linked to the Victorian period through its documentation. William Bottrell, a Cornish folklorist, recorded the legends in 1873. The story involves a mermaid luring a young man away from St. Senera's church in Zenor, resonates with the Victorian sensation with folklore and the supernatural. While the legend itself is older, its recorded popularization during the Victorian era solidified its place in the cultural consciousness. Um, what we also see rather later on is that there are multiple interpretation movies, um, interpretation of in movies of mermaids, for instance, the Three Tales, um, Peter Pan, and all of the senses sort of a sensationalized marvels in a very different way than that was seen in the Victorian era. So this is the change of trends that we are seeing in modern times in case of mermaids. Knox, you will take on from here.
So the next creature we're focusing on today is the sea serpent. So the sea serpent's origin was the public fascination with the sea monster. It was clearly evoked by Sarah Perry in her neo-Victorian novel, The Essex Serpent, 2016. In the opening pages, a young man has a close encounter with an object in the waves. At first, only the tongue of the moon on the tide, which then coheres into a slow movement of something vast, hunched, and implacable monsters born in water. Spellbound, the characters contemplate the vast mysteries of the deep species that might have been missed. Perry anachronistically mentions the Loch Ness monster, which only came to fame in the 1930s, but her comments embody the behemoth's appeal. The sea serpent gained currency in early mid-Victorian period because there seemed to be plenty of evidence of its existence, with experienced sailors making report of the sea creature and the public observing it from land. The most detailed of these is the Great Sea Serpent by A.C. Odemans, presented as a quasi-scientific tome which aims to legitimize its subject by deploying academic conventions to give an impression of the rational objectivity. Odemans present an elaborate case, insisting in its agreement with theorists such as Henry Lee and John Gibson that serpents exist in abundance. Sea serpents are often represented in the dress of people of that age with the advancement of science. Therefore, there was a sharp increase with the number of the sighting of sea serpents and similar animals. Now, coming to its modern representation, um, the term Hydra has become a catch for all number of different dragonic monsters, including the titulus sea serpent. in the 1984 Spanish monster movie, The Sea Serpent, also known as Hydra Monster, from the deep directed by the Armando de Osorio of Songs of the Blinded fame. The Sea Serpent was one of the many movies released in the cash on the success even Spielberg's Jaws. However, where that movie just had a big shark, this movie brought in an actual sea serpent, reawakened by a nuclear detonation in the Atlantic Ocean. The next, um, the next feature for today is the spring heel shark. The spring heel shark is exactly like a sea creature, but it had an appealing history in the Victorian literature. The spring-heeled shark was first mentioned in the Victorian era, specifically in the penny dreadful publications of the 1860s with the serial Spring-Heeled Shark, The Terror of London, being a prominent example. While not a novel or in the poem, the traditional sense that these serials akin to Victorian tabloids feature in the characters of a series of weekly installments. According to a publication in London by Gaslight, the first mention of the character is in London is linked to 1837 with a letter to the mayor describing a mysterious attacker. The first alleged sightings of these spring fleas made in London in 1837, and the last reported sighting is set in the most of the secondary literature which have been made in Liverpool in 1902. Uh, the next feature is the lantern worm. The lantern worm, a legend tale from the country Durham, England, was first mentioned in Victorian literature in the song "The Lantern Worm" by C.M. Lumley. Published in 1867, it was also later referenced in Bram Stoker's 1911 novel "The Lair of the White Worm." While the legend itself is older, dating back centuries, its first appearance is in the Victorian era literature is within the Lantern Worm and subsequently in Stoker's novel. The song was written for a pantomime and is popular version of the tale. Stoker's novel, while not directly based on the song, draws heavily on Stoker's novel legend. The Lantern Worm is a legend from the country Durham, England. The story takes place in northeast England in folklore and have been adapted and written in oral tradition into pantomime and song formats. Now over to my friend Shivali.
So far we have seen a number of sea creatures that have either originated in the sea and later came out in the lands, therefore signifying this transverse not only throughout the sea, but rather from sea to land towards the inner worlds. Um, Next, if we go to this, huh, right. If we now switch to Ryujin and other similar sea animals that had its sightings during the Victorian age, but not in the Victorian maritime surrounding era, but how it's traversed to the Japanese traversed to Japan, and how it got sensationalized there. We take evolution, we see that in the case of Kappa, Shoja, and Ryujin, the Victorian cryptids often symbolized fear of the unknown, while yokai like Kappa and Ryujin were spiritual guides or warnings. We have had, if you remember, we have had similar ideation of spiritual guides or warnings in Greek mythology and Roman mythology as well. So there is what I'm trying to point out here is a change and the traversion of the myth again. The Victorian cryptids were visualized through engravings like Dore's Leviathan, while yokai were depicted in Yukiei prints like Hokusai's Kappa. The Japanese yokai during the Meiji era, that is 1868 to 1912, overlapped with the Victorian period. Japan opened to Western influences, leading to cultural exchanges. Yokai folklore was documented in texts like Lafcadio's Hearn's Kawaidan, 1904, written in the late Victorian era, which introduced Kappa and Ayakasi to Western audience. If we come to the relevance of it, the late Victorian period saw early cross-cultural exchanges with yokai like Kappa appearing in Western literature and Victorian cryptids influencing global maritime lore, setting the stage for modern globalist media. What you also see is that the pirate ballads, the sea song, and the chanties that we see later on, the chanties being the songs of the sea sailors. In the songs of the sea sailors, we see this fabrication of different sea animals, and in the point at that point of time, traversing this chanties or shanties also played a very important role in this cultural exchange that we are talking about here. Um, in modern films and anime, what has been continued is this visual tradition with CGI kraken and stylized yokai in Princess Mononoke, in various Studio Ghibli movies. In modern media, both yokai kappa are reimagined within the humanistic and environmental themes, as seen in the Shape of Water's empathic amphibian man and Princess Mononoke's eco-conscious shoujo. So what you also see here is that this not only a cultural traversion, but also a proper cultural traversion along with the current thematologies that are plaguing us. The idea of eco-criticism throughout this traversion and all that is also being represented in modern films and animes. Narrative adaptations in the films like Pirates of the Caribbean retains the Victorian sense of a spectacle, while anime like Selkies explore psychological and social issues, reflecting Japan's introspective storytelling styles. We have a number of animes made in Japan that have often played with this idea of kappa, sojo, ryujin, this yokai, nui, ayakashi, um, all of them. And also, we cannot forget the idea of One Piece as well. One Piece is a sea anime, basically, which is happening in the sea all over throughout its 1,000+ episodes. And in in One Piece, we see many representations of this similar stylized sea animals that were seen that was like another example can be Pixar's Luca, Studio Ghibli's Ponyo, How to Train Your Dragon. We see various sea dragons. So all these are the extensions of all the Victorian era sea animals, and also at the point of time when the writing started to take place, and then all the globalization, the prelude of globalization started to happen, and with all this cultural tributes throughout the place, this ideas behind this Victorian maritime cryptids spread throughout the entire world. Later on, we also see this idea of another Victorian maritime cryptids, water leopard. The first media mention of water leopard was documented in Ward Sykes' British Goblin that was published in 1880, a Victorian folklore collection. Described as a predatory creature that lures fishermen into water, it was a regional maritime myth reflecting Victorian interest in local folklore and water-based dangers. Its bat-like wings and serpentine tail echoed sea dragon imagery, blending terrestrial and aquatic fears. But what is interesting here is that this term water leopard, why leopard? Leopard has an association with this idea of social stigma, neglected tropical disease, isolation, and fear. So if you had leprosy at the point of time, they didn't have any multi-drug therapy like we have for now. So it was a proclamation of death. So sea creatures not only was exemplified by this very huge uh, hundreds of feet of animals, but also small animals like water leopard, which was characterized by this fear of tropical disease and isolation and fear. If we next we come to Selkies. In Selkies, the first literary media mentioned was documented in the Victorian folklore collection, such as John Gregorson's Campbell's Superstitions of the Highlands and Islands of the Scotland. Um, Selkies were depicted as tragic figures, often omen. Important point being omen as a representation how Selkies were represented in how women were represented throughout this Victorian maritime period. Often women trapped in human marriages, reflecting themes of freedom and captivity. Their maritime nature tied them to Victorian mermaid myths, with a focus on transformation and loss. Um, Mermaids and Selkies have often been confused throughout a lot of literature and text, since they both sort of were a result of both male gaze and female gaze, and they both represented women in one way or another. So the Finfolks, Marrow, all of these are the different names or selkies that we see in different parts of the world. And again, all this represents is this cultural traverse through our cultural traversion of this our constant contentious consciousness, not only the idea of it, but rather the what the idea represents that we are appropriating according to our culture. In modern representations, a lesser known Irish movie, The Secrets of Roanoke Mermaids, called Selkies, and released in 1994. It is about a girl who goes to live in an Irish fishing village and hears stories about people's ancestors who married Selkies. Selkies are seals that can become human by taking off their seal skins in one representation. They're beautiful, and if men steal their skins, they can force the Selkies to stay and live with them. Men stealing the seals of Selkies and in order to force them to live with them is another representation of the male gaze towards this cryptids, Victorian era cryptids that we also still have now. Um, if we see, for instance, in mermaid representation, the various representations of mermaid, the Little Mermaid, the modern representations of Disney, it's also in a way the story has been changed. The story has been changed in a way it has been given a very happy sort of ending, and it's a very sort of in a way sexist representation of it. The freedom that we are often used to see in the representation of Victorian era time, that we do not see in in the modern time. So there is an evident change in gaze, even in male gaze, that we see in the case of Victorian maritime cryptids that from then to now. The movie is about the movie where the man could steal of the Selkies and force them to live with them. The movie is about trying to find a boy who was lost when his mother, a Selkie, found her sealskin and went back to live in the water. This movie recalls Irish folktales of Selkies but represents Selkies positively as beautiful, kind to humans, and even good vibes. Um, Finally, that we come here is that the global popularity of anime as well as the other thing, what you can see is that throughout this represent extensive study of Victorian maritime mythical sea creatures, such as the kraken, the mermaids, the sea serpents, it reveals the profound role of cultural artifacts in the era's nautical psyche. This fantastical being, woven from sailors' soul, scientific curiosity, romantic imagination, translated mere folklore to save Victorian literature, art, and even early maritime shipping. They embodied the era's complex interplay of awe, dread, fascination with the uncharted abyss. This research underscores how these myths, meticulously crafted and perpetuated, not only explored the enduring tension between human knowledge and the ocean's untamed mysteries, but also what you notice is that how these fascinations have transcended in modern representation as well as how they have changed forms in that process. So